You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 325, The Threat of Peace. Last time we covered the struggles of the Continental Army in late 1782 and early 1783 to deal with the fact that the war was coming to an end, and that Congress seemed inclined to break every promise it had made to the officers and men who had sacrificed so much to end this war. Washington had to snuff out a potential mutiny by the officers at Newburgh, New York. This week, we're going to take a look at that same crisis from Congress's point of view. Now, of course, a big part of the problem was that Congress was broke. This was nothing new. Congress had financed the first few years of the war based on printing paper promissory notes that would somehow be reimbursed later. Those reimbursements never came, and Congress just needed more and more money to fund the war. By 1779, that paper money, the Continental dollar, was worthless, and Congress couldn't even issue any more. By 1780, most of its money was coming from French loans and a handful of other European loans. Even those loans, however, were not enough to cover the costs of the war. In 1781, Congress had appointed Robert Morris as Superintendent of Finance. Morris created the Bank of North America to receive loan money from abroad and issued paper notes against that money to circulate as currency. These so-called Morris notes carried Robert Morris's personal guarantee of payment, meaning that people who might no longer trust Congress to repay might trust one of the wealthiest merchants in North America instead. While Morris could play some financial games to keep things going, there also had to be some permanent solution to pay for the war. Congress had tried to compel the states to provide funds based on the relative wealth of each state. The states, however, simply refused to pay, and Congress really couldn't do anything about it. In late 1782, Morris received part of the final French loan, and with it word came that this was the last loan that the U.S. would receive. France provided this last loan to ensure that the U.S. remained in the war until France finalized its peace treaty with Britain. But once that happened, France had zero interest in pouring more money into U.S. coffers. In fact, it wanted the U.S. to start repaying its older loans. With debts continuing to pile up and no future revenue in sight, Morris decided to up the ante. In June of 1782, he just stopped making interest payments on all government debt. Many creditors had relied on these interest payments. These were merchants who had supported the cause for years and had eventually hoped to be repaid. The failure even to pay interest on the debt made clear to all that Congress was reneging on its financial promises. When creditors began to accost Morris about their money, he pointed out that he was one of the largest creditors who was being cut off, and he recommended that the creditors unite and petition Congress and the states to do something about repaying their debts. In July, Morris issued his Report on Public Credit, essentially saying that the U.S. had massive debts from the war and no way to repay them. He suggested a number of options to raise revenue, the main source being a 5% tariff on all imports. Unlike earlier efforts, this would be a direct tax collected by Confederation agents at all major ports. The problem was that any revenue act needed the support of all 13 states. Congress finally got 12 of the states to vote to support the tariff, but little old Rhode Island refused. The Rhode Island leaders thought that a tariff on imports was unfair since most of their revenue came from imports. Rhode Island wanted to raise revenue in some other way, perhaps a property tax for funding the war, or the sale of Western lands, both of which would mean that the bulk of the repayment would fall on other states. Also, you have to remember that the whole Revolutionary War had been fought over the idea that states should be the only entity allowed to collect taxes. So, giving that power to a different outside entity seemed to run against the whole premise of the war itself. Now, of course, Morris and others in Congress pressured Rhode Island for months to agree to the tariff. Morris even hired Thomas Paine to publish a series of articles in support of the tariff. At one time, years earlier, Morris and Paine had been political foes, but Paine needed the money and seemed to support the idea that a national tariff would help bind the Union together. In December, Congress sent a delegation to Rhode Island to put some personal pressure on the state to accept the tariff as an absolute necessity. While on their way, the delegation learned that Virginia had decided to repeal its approval of the tariff. Since Rhode Island was no longer the only holdout, the delegation simply turned around and returned to Philadelphia. Virginia's change of heart was largely the result of Delegate Arthur Lee. You may recall that Lee had been a diplomat in Europe for many years. While there, he had made himself enemies of Silas Deane, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams. Lee seemed to see conspiracies wherever he went and was not shy about spreading misinformation about them. As a delegate to Congress, he set his sights on Robert Morris. Lee simply did not trust the financier and figured there had to be some corruption if the man had access to so much money. Lee got Virginia legislators to kill the tariff bill simply as an effort to cut down Morris's power. I think it's also telling that Lee wanted Morris to resign and probably wanted to replace Morris as the superintendent of finance so that he could be in charge of all that money. About the same time, the congressional delegation returned to Philadelphia to face a dead tariff bill. The Continental Army delegation, headed by General Alexander McDougall, showed up, demanding answers on pay and pensions. A few weeks later, in January 1783, Morris delivered some more bad news. Congress had already overdrawn its loans from France, and that they essentially had no choice but to keep overdrawing on those accounts, as it was the only source of funds available. With no money for anything, Congress really couldn't guarantee the delegation anything, so their counteroffer via Morris was simply 1 month's pay in specie to help tide them over. Now, around this same time, when Morris had promised 1 month's pay to the Northern Army, he received a note from General Nathaniel Greene saying that Greene had had to promise his men 2 months' pay to keep them from walking away from their occupation of Charleston. Morris, of course, knew that if he gave 1 month's pay to the Northern Army and 2 months' pay to the Southern Army, the Northern Army was going to be particularly unhappy. And of course, even coming up with 1 month's worth of pay was nearly impossible. Morris hoped to continue to overdraw his French credit, but around this time he also received a note from French Minister Luzerne saying, "Hey, you've overspent all the French credit. Please stop drawing more on French credit." Now, Morris was also counting on the sale of some Morris notes in Cuba that he wanted to exchange for specie that he could use to pay the army. Morris constantly had little deals like this going around where he was shuffling money, trying to bring in whatever he could to pay whatever expenses he could. So Morris eventually had no choice but to agree to pay the 2 months' pay to the Southern Army, but he put it on the books as sending 1 month's pay, and the remainder of the money was placed on the books as repayment for supplies. He hoped this would prevent the Northern Army from finding out that the Southern Army got more pay. Even if the money from Cuba arrived in time to pay the Army, Morris was completely out of ideas on how he might get any more money to keep the government going. With ever-mounting debts and no hope of revenue, Morris didn't see anything more he could do. He submitted his notice of resignation to the President of Congress, effective May 31st. Now, some historians have argued that Morris announced this privately and several months in advance, hoping to light a fire under Congress to get them to approve some sort of revenue bill. Now, that certainly was a possibility. Morris had grown very frustrated and was fed up with trying to find new ways to juggle credit for money that they didn't have and never would have. Morris confided in his diary that he believed failure to repay debts was simply unjust, and if that was the road Congress was going to take, he didn't want to be any part of it. Congress remained divided. There were delegates like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison who strongly advocated for revenue measures to pay the Army and government creditors. Then there were others like Arthur Lee who feared giving Congress any power over money, seeing as a threat to states' rights. Hamilton took the initiative in Congress, rising to introduce 4 resolutions. The first supported providing 1 month's pay to the Army that the committee had already promised. Second was a resolution that the states would be responsible for all back pay of their soldiers up until August 1st of 1780. From that point on, Congress would be responsible for all the back pay. The third resolution called on Congress to make every effort to obtain the necessary money, either through state requisitions or direct revenue measures, but it needed to raise the money necessary to pay off its creditors. This resolution was really vague on how to make it work, but they wanted to put it in there that this was something Congress needed to work on. His final resolution needed to confirm its half-pay pensions for life for the Continental officers, as Congress had promised years earlier, or come up with some lump sum payment for a certain period of years in lieu of that promised pension. With the Army on the verge of mutiny, Congress approved the 1 month's pay. The other resolutions, though, ran into considerable debate. Some states wanted to move up the state responsibilities from August until December of 1780, but eventually the August 1st date was passed. The August 1st date was relevant because that's when Morris had taken over the Department of Finance, and he wanted to deal with all the costs during his tenure. Debate over the third resolution, actually raising some money, ground into a debate about what forms of revenue were constitutional under the Articles of Confederation. So that never went anywhere. The debate over pensions was a larger one, and it wasn't just about the money. Opponents of pensions believed that making men dependent on government pay was a blow against freedom. It would make them lazy and dependent on government handouts. It would also create political support for a stronger central government that had to be there to make those payments. This is something that many of the delegates opposed. Much of the debate this time centered around just how big a lump sum they needed to provide instead of that lifetime pension. Hamilton proposed 6 years. Congress rejected it. Other proposals ranged from 5 years to 6.5 years, and all of those were rejected as well. As the debate went on, it became clear that many delegates, especially from New England, were not going to support any pay at any level. So Congress ended up tabling the discussion until the states could consider whether to send new delegates. By February of 1783, word arrived from Europe that the two sides had reached a preliminary peace treaty. Most people, of course, took this as good news. It also made it difficult for Congress to do anything for the Army since the soldiers would no longer be needed. There was also a pressing concern that when Congress ordered the Army to disband, the men might not return home until they got what they were promised. In short, the end of the war meant a deadline for Congress to figure out how it was going to keep its promises for when the war ended. Congress continued to debate a funding scheme that would allow them to pay back the debts they owed. It also debated exactly who should be paid back. A new argument developed among some who thought the Army should get priority for payment and that other creditors would just have to wait until after the Army got paid. Another faction disagreed with this and thought that all creditors deserved repayment. Making other creditors wait behind the Army might mean that they never got paid, since all real political pressure was coming from the Army. After the Army got paid, what political pressure would there be to repay the rest of them? Also, many of the creditors were some of the most powerful men in each state. If these men saw little to no hope of repayment, they would likely oppose the taxes that Congress had to have them enact in order to raise the revenue to repay all the debts. Tempers flared in Congress, but neither side could get anything done. The Nationalists, led by delegates like Alexander Hamilton, believed it was a moral duty for Congress to repay everyone who had lent money or property to the cause, as well as the soldiers who had sacrificed so many years. Another big supporter among the Nationalists was Gouverneur Morris, who was an assistant to Robert Morris in managing the nation's finances. Although the two men share a last name, they were not related. Robert Morris is from Pennsylvania. Gouverneur Morris had come to Philadelphia as a delegate from New York and was now working in the Department of Finance. Gouverneur wrote to General Henry Knox, warning the general that some in Congress were hoping to dump the obligation to pay the Army onto the state governments rather than having Congress make sure everyone got paid. He also warned about the idea that some were floating in Congress about paying the Army first and other creditors after that. While the officers might find that tempting, Morris warned that the plan would destroy any effort to implement a tax that could begin to pay everyone. He urged the Army to express support for the Nationalist plan to raise direct revenue to pay both the Army and the other creditors. A few days later, Morris wrote a similar note to Nathaniel Greene in Charleston on these same matters. The officers in the Army, however, were reluctant to support either side. They did not want to alienate any delegates, and they were open to just about any solutions that the delegates adopted that meant they would get their pay and benefits. Exactly how that was going to happen was up to Congress and not for them to say. Unable to come up with a solution, some delegates in Congress proposed something different. Why don't we just not allow the Army to disband and go home, even after there's a final peace treaty? We'll just keep the Army intact and have them stay there under their officers' command until all their benefits had been paid. The purpose of such a plan was that it would give Congress more time to come up with a solution without having to reach that final moment when they sent the soldiers home with nothing. Some Continental officers, including General Knox, approved of this idea. It would keep pressure on Congress to resolve the pay issue quickly, and it would mean that the men would not mutiny on their own and get angry at Congress rather than simply returning home. Of course, doing this came with its own problems. The main one being that most of the soldiers and officers were more than ready to go home. They needed to get back to work and they wanted to be with their families. They had enlisted for the length of the war. The government had no authority to hold them to service once the war was over. Such a solution would also mean that Congress would be obligated to continue to pay for food and clothing and additional months' pay. Also, standing armies in peacetime had been argued as a sign of tyranny before the war began and during the early years of the war. Most delegates believed that Congress should never support a standing army in time of peace. So nobody really seemed to have a good solution in sight. Hamilton wrote to General Washington about the impasse in Congress and recommended that the Army, probably through General Knox, should put more pressure on Congress to find a resolution. Now, some historians have taken these letters to mean that Hamilton wanted to let the Army mutiny and march on Philadelphia. Of course, the correspondence doesn't say that explicitly, but they argue that Hamilton had to be circumspect about what he really wanted. To me, the letter indicates that Hamilton simply wanted more efforts by the Army to petition and have the officers meet with Congress to lobby them. There really doesn't seem to be any suggestions of mutiny even implied. Around the same time, Hamilton did also put more pressure on delegates by spreading the view that General Washington was losing popularity within the Army because Washington was standing by Congress. In a discussion with several other delegates in a private setting, Hamilton suggested that the officers might overthrow Washington, select a new leader who would fight for their interests. Although the name of this alternative leader was not recorded, it appears that he was talking about General Horatio Gates. At the end of February, Congress once again took up the debate over pensions. The delegates finally agreed to offer a lump sum payment of 5 years' salary in lieu of half-pay pensions for life. Now, while they finally agreed on this number, that still did nothing to settle where the money to pay those lump sums was going to come from. By March, things reached a boiling point in Newburgh, and as we covered the details of which last week, the officers met with the apparent intent of taking action, but General Washington was able to talk them down and await further action by Congress. Once Washington had resolved the matter, he wrote to President Boudinot and other members of Congress, telling them the crisis was calm for now, but that Congress had to do something to keep its promises to the Army. Around this same time, Robert Morris doubled down on his threat to resign in May, telling Congress that he planned to make his decision public. Doing this, of course, would create a complete financial panic. Congress called his bluff and granted the request. Almost immediately, the delegates began attacking Morris in the press for being the cause of all America's financial woes. Meanwhile, Congress got serious about coming up with a funding plan. To allay fears about a permanent national tax, some members suggested limiting the tax to just 25 years. Opponents argued they could not do this unless they could also guarantee that all debts would be paid off within that time period. Several months earlier, the states had been asked to survey their lands and report back on their value. Congress looked at a number of possible formulations for taxes, taking into account the various state populations, wealth, possession of Western lands, how much the states had already paid into the war effort, etc. Now, one big point of contention that came up during this debate was how to count slaves. Northern wanted to count slaves as part of the population. Southerners objected to this on the basis that slaves would be counted twice. They would be counted as people for population purposes, but they would also be counted as part of the value of the state's property for property purposes. Benjamin Harrison proposed a compromise where slaves would be counted as just half of a person. A delegate from New England suggested that maybe the number should be 3/4. After some more discussion, a proposal by James Madison finally agreed to count the slaves as 3/5 of a person. Debate was interrupted on March 12th when a ship arrived with the preliminary peace treaty between the U.S. and Britain. While this was the preliminary treaty, the ship had left France 3 months earlier. By the time it arrived, most people assumed that everything had already been finalized in Europe. Less than 2 weeks later, another message arrived reporting a general peace agreement that resulted in the cessation of all hostilities. Now, these messages were coming to Congress at the same time that Washington's reports of his Newburgh Address and his urgent petitions for Congress to act on something also arrived. Amidst all this pressure, Congress finally agreed to a commutation of officer pensions into a lump sum. Meanwhile, Washington's letters to friends in Philadelphia, including Hamilton, revealed his suspicion that the nationalists in Congress were using the Army as a pawn in order to create a larger source of continental currency. He suspected the delegates were willing to refuse to disband the Army and provide separation pay in a scheme to force Congress to adopt a stronger national economic plan. In one of his letters, Washington famously warned Hamilton that, quote, "The Army, considering the irritable state it is in, its sufferings and composition, is a dangerous instrument to play with." Next week, the war is coming to an end, but not everyone has gotten word. The British attacked the Spanish Fort Carlos in what is today Arkansas. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Celentano, and Michael Mulhern. And thanks to Robert Morris Circle supporters, Greg Pusak, and 10 Crucial Days. I also want to thank Don Venditto for a one-time gift via PayPal. Now, this week's look at the Continental Congress focused on the fact that the war was ending and someone had to pay all the bills. Everyone seemed to be okay with borrowing money during the war, but now that it came time to pay those bills, no one seemed willing to step up and consider it. The states all seemed to think that other states should owe more based on whatever reasoning justified that outcome. The states also seemed very reluctant to give the Continental Congress any sort of power over taxation in any way. As a result, those in Congress saw things differently and really couldn't come to any consensus. The states' rights folks simply seemed to see Congress as a way to organize the 13 separate countries during the war, and they really didn't want to form a single country. The other group, what I've been calling the nationalists, saw the union of these 13 states as absolutely necessary for their long-term survival. They were looking for ways to strengthen the bond between the states now that the one thing that had brought them together, the war, was coming to an end. The war debt was quickly becoming what would make or break the Union. The states' rights folks thought they should simply divide up the debt in some equitable way and go their separate ways. Now, they'd probably keep around the Continental Congress to serve as some sort of a regional diplomatic tool to work out future disagreements between the states, but that was about it. The nationalists wanted a more powerful central government, and they wanted to keep the debt as the responsibility of that government as a way of forcing the states to give it a funding source and to make it a relevant thing that people wanted to keep around. It seems like the strongest nationalists came out of the Continental Army. These men had spent years fighting alongside one another and really came to appreciate the value of the men from other states. They had moved past the parochial prejudices that divided the states and saw the advantages of behaving more like a single country. Alexander Hamilton, who grew up outside of any state, seemed to be one of the strongest and most vocal advocates of this view. That said, there were others who were not really coming out of the Continental Army, like James Madison, who also supported this idea of a stronger central government. The disagreements over these competing views would last at least for another decade, and in some ways we're still fighting over states' rights issues today. Congress eventually passed a bill that gave limited power for only 25 years to collect tariffs and to continue to make some cash requisitions from the states to pay off the Army and the nation's creditors. But this was a very weak bill. Hamilton voted against it because it was so weak. Even if everything worked as planned, it would not be enough to pay off the debts when it expired in 25 years. Robert Morris was also highly critical, but in the end, this was the best they were going to do with the Congress they had. Congress also managed to convince Morris not to resign in May, as he had threatened. He ended up sticking around until November of 1784. When he did finally leave, Congress appointed a three-man panel to replace him, and one of those three men was Morris's arch foe, Arthur Lee. I'll talk more about how the plans actually worked in a future episode, but the bottom line is that government really still had no plan on how it was ever going to pay off its debts. As far as the pension fight, even though Congress promised a lump sum payment to the officers, it still didn't have the money to pay that sum. And another big source of contention was that the enlisted men got nothing. There wasn't even a consideration of a pension for them. And as far as making that 5-year lump sum payment, Congress was just struggling to give the officers and men 3 months' worth of severance pay. And I'll get into more details about that in a future episode. Congress didn't get around to passing a real pension bill at all until 1818, 35 years later. By that time, many veterans were, of course, dead from old age. A teenager in 1778 would have been in his 60s by then. That 1818 bill also only gave assistance to soldiers who were living in poverty. It was not a general pension bill, so you had to prove not only that you had served in the Continental Army for a certain period of time, you had to prove that, well, you were already obviously elderly, but that you couldn't even support yourself financially. It wasn't until 1832 that Congress passed a comprehensive pension bill. Of course, by that time, more than 50 years had passed, and not too many veterans were still alive even to make a claim. Some of the later pension benefits did also give benefits to widows of veterans, and there's a fun trivia fact for you. The last widow's pension from the Revolutionary War ended in 1906. Esther Sumner Damon had married a veteran in 1835 when she was 21 years old and her husband was 75 years old. The husband never got a pension, but after his death in 1853, Esther applied as a widow of a Revolutionary War veteran, and she died at the age of 92 in 1906, when she was still receiving $24 a month. My book recommendation this week is A Crisis of Peace, George Washington, the Newburgh Conspiracy, and the Fate of the American Revolution by David Head. This book really focuses on the events discussed this week and little else. It's an in-depth look at how the Army disbanded and returned to civilian life while respecting the authority of Congress, if not its competence. The book is a little over 200 pages, not counting notes and index. I've actually recommended this book once before, in 2019 when it was first published, but now that we've gotten to the actual subject matter it covers, I think it's worth recommending again. So if you're interested, get a copy of A Crisis of Peace by David Head. My online recommendation is an article entitled Robert Morris and Reporting for the Treasury under the U.S. Continental Congress by Michael Schoderbeck. This was first published in the Accounting Historian's Journal in 1999. You can access the article on JSTOR, although you will need to have a free account in order to get access to the full article. It provides a great amount of detail on just what a financial mess Congress was in by the end of the war, so if that interests you, take a look. As always, I've provided direct links on my blog and website. My question this week comes from Michael Higgins, who asks, in the famous painting by Loitzy, it shows large chunks of ice in the river when Washington crossed on Christmas evening, 1776. Since it was early winter and the river probably hadn't frozen and the temperature was causing driving rain, sleet, and snow, it seems totally impossible that there were large chunks of ice in the river. In your great knowledge of the time, have you ever heard that issue discussed? Well, Michael, you are correct that there are many inaccuracies in the Leutze painting, but I think the ice chunks are certainly not among the worst inaccuracies. You may recall that there were several attempts to cross the Delaware on Christmas night. And just to refute another error, not one made by this question, but which people commonly make, the crossing did not take place on Christmas Eve. It took place on the evening of December 25th for an attack on the morning of 26th. The attempted crossings further downriver failed because ice did make it too difficult to reach the shore. Washington's crossing above Trenton Falls was only possible because the current was a little faster and thus freezing a little less. There was a nor'easter raging, resulting in strong winds along with freezing rain and snow. During the day, before the night crossing, it was below freezing but sunny. The storm came in overnight and dropped into the low 20s. Colonel Henry Knox, who crossed with Washington at Washington's crossing, wrote to his wife about the crossing saying, quote, "Floating ice in the water made the labor almost incredible." Another eyewitness commented that a violent storm of rain, hail, and snow, coupled with the ice floes and high winds, slowed operations. Now we know that those trying to cross further downstream were prevented from doing so because of ice that prevented them from getting the boats to shore. The ice had grown thick enough that they couldn't get boats through it, but it also was not solid enough to walk on. It's common when ice floes come down that they pile up below Trenton Falls as the tide slows the flow of the river there. And that's likely what blocked the lower crossing attempts. Where Washington crossed, the ice had formed but not strong enough to prevent the boats from landing, and his men made it, albeit many hours later than they planned. But the eyewitness accounts at Washington's crossing seem to describe floating chunks, not just a thin layer of ice on the river. The Leutze painting shows thick blocks of ice, whereas later conditions on the Delaware River tend to show thinner, flatter chunks of ice forming. And we suspect that's what they actually encountered. So the shape of the ice block may be a little off in the painting, but we'll have to forgive an artist who never saw the Delaware River. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on Twitter, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.